Well, the next focus on our show today is the situation in Australia. Now, the Australian state of Victoria is reporting its biggest daily increase in coronavirus cases since the pandemic began, as an outbreak in the city of Melbourne continues to grow. Police in Melbourne are also preparing for more protests against the pandemic lockdown. Meanwhile, the vaccination drive is continuing in Australia, and some of the big cities are going to be easing their restrictions soon. Well, to talk more about that, we're joined by Professor Nikolai Petrovsky, Professor of Medicine, Flinders University. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us. Firstly, if you could tell us what is the situation like right now in Australia?
So the situation is still relatively under control compared to other countries. So in most of Australia, we still have no virus transmission, including South Australia and Adelaide, where I'm based. There are two outbreaks going on at the moment, one in New South Wales, where they've actually passed the peak with a lockdown, and the cases are now coming down. They're around about 1,000 cases a day. And of course, in Victoria, which started later, seeded from New South Wales, where the cases are still going up, and I think have reached about 750 cases today. And of course, we've seen a lot of riots and police action going on in Victoria, which unfortunately is going to mean more transmission, and it will make it harder to control that outbreak. But overall, Australia is doing very well relative to the rest of the world.
Right. And yes, the concern is, as you mentioned, about these protests and how they will become super spreader events. And already one or two people have tested positive, isn't it, from these protests?
That's right. I mean, this is one of the ironies, is the people who want the lockdowns to end are probably guaranteeing that the lockdowns will have to go on longer than necessary because of their actions. So that's one of the great ironies, is they're actually going to make it harder for authorities to break the back of the current outbreak.
And this outbreak is driven by the Delta variant. And if you could tell us a bit about that, because this is something that many countries are fighting against, the Delta variant being more infectious, and it spreads more quickly. And that's why authorities are so concerned about this particular outbreak of COVID.
Absolutely. I mean, the transmission rate of Delta is much higher than the original strains. It's much easier to catch from another person. There have been episodes where just people passing in the street have managed to transmit it from one person to another. So, we know it's transmitted by aerosols. It's highly infectious. It's much harder to bring these outbreaks under control than when we were trying to control outbreaks a year ago. So Delta is certainly a big problem here. I guess the future threat, though, is the mu virus, which obviously is increasing in the number of countries and looks to be maybe an even bigger problem, Delta. But at the moment, it's Delta that is the only significant virus in Australia.
Now, what's been interesting is the change in strategy in Australia. You had a zero, COVID strategy earlier. You're hoping to have absolutely no cases of COVID. But now, because of the Delta variant, there's been a rethink on that strategy, isn't it?
Yes, look, I think, the strategy right now should still be, zero transmission. And I think that's achievable. New South Wales are bringing their outbreak under control. So we could get back to zero, but I think politicians now realise that that's not sustainable in the long term. We have to re-engage with the rest of the world. We need to restore travel. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is to find a way that we can actually live with the virus, which means getting very high immunisation rates and then basically letting the virus also circulate. That's going to be a very difficult transition for a country like Australia that's gone 18 months with almost no deaths from COVID, because when we get to that transition point, we have to accept that there are going to be a significant number of infections and deaths as a result of that change in policy. So I'm not sure that all the population are ready for that right now.
Right, though there has been a boost in your vaccination drive in Australia, and that's something that could give a certain amount of confidence, to ease restrictions.
Well, that's true, and you know we started late, and we've caught up very fast, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney where these outbreaks are. So that's an incentive of people to get vaccinated. We're slowly getting more vaccine supplies from overseas because we don't currently have a domestic vaccine. But I think what we have to realise is, of course, that the vaccines we have wear off very fast. So we have to be careful that we don't end up in a situation where everyone's vaccinated, but by the time we relax the barriers to entry of the virus, we don't want to be in a situation where the vaccines have actually already worn off, as we've seen happen, for instance, in Israel. So it's going to be all about getting the timing right.
There are a lot of experts now who feel, at least here in India, that we're moving towards an endemic stage of coronavirus. Currently, the big debate around the world is about inequity in the vaccination. So what is your view on how long the world is going to be dealing with this pandemic?
So I think if we're talking about dealing with COVID-19, I think, this is going to stay in human populations for forever. I think we have to accept that. We're not going to be able to eradicate it, unfortunately. Of course, we'll get beyond the pandemic phase. The pandemic phase is when, you have that peak of infections and everyone's getting infected. At some point that will settle down to a more stable state, particularly if we can get enough people vaccinated. So over the next 12 to 24 months, I think most of the world will be no longer regarding it as a pandemic. But that's not to say they won't be dealing with infections, but they'll be at lower levels. And of course, you're right. I mean, the big inequity right now is countries or continents like Africa have had almost zero vaccine delivered. Right. While you have countries with high rates, you also have countries with very low rates. And that's not obviously equitable, and we need to do more. And we're certainly, in discussions to take our vaccine to Africa as soon as it gets approved, because that's where the need is greatest.
All right, we hope that happens fast. And finally, do you think we'll ever know, for sure the origins of COVID? I know you're part of that letter to the Lancet. Your views on that?
So, look, I think we've seen some very damning documents released in the last few days detailing research projects that were being undertaken in Wuhan in recent years, where they were genetically manipulating coronaviruses and seeing gain of function, which they have up till now denied that those experiments were being undertaken. I think we've now seen very hard proof that, in fact, that type of research was, in fact, going on. And so I think that really does, again, highlight the fact that this could well be a laboratory release of a virus, an accidental laboratory release. So I think, although there's not definitive evidence, the weight of evidence is moving more and more towards this having been, unfortunately, an accidental laboratory leak in Wuhan.
All right, so that's where you stand on this. Thank you so much, Professor Nikolai Petrovsky, for joining us on the program.